Mary Danvers was pretty. Mary Danvers was pretty. Nowadays, she scares the patients at the Pumpkin Patch Institute in the western area of Massachusetts. Some of the patients that require less care maintain their manners with her, but some of the more unfortunate cases throw tantrums when they see her face. The only reason she's still employed there is because the board of directors feels so bad about what happened to her that they just can't fire Mary. Some of her co-workers resigned after the incident, since the rearranging of Mary's face. There's no bother trying to describe what she looks like now. Oh, but there's an Instagram profile that has pictures of what she looks like before that prove that Mary Danvers was once a great beauty. It was the joke she made that Mr. Irving overheard that made him assign Mary Danvers to the case of one Mr. Darwin Marigold, who had turned into a chimpanzee one summer. "At least he doesn't monkey around," Mary had said to her co-workers one morning in the break room. She was putting her lunch away for the day in the fridge, a Tupperware container of chicken Alfredo that she had ordered from a restaurant the night before. None of her co-workers warned her when Mr. Irving entered the break room, coming in with his white lab coat sweeping like a cape. Her back was to him, so she continued, "When we first got him, I thought he was going to fling feces at us. That diaper he wears is adorable, though, and the way Rebecca holds his hand while walking him down the hall. Mrs. Danvers." Dr. Irving smiled. His voice boomed a little. Mary Danvers snapped and turned around to face her superior, who clasped his hands in front of him, most meditatively. "You aren't talking about our lovely resident, Mr. Marigold, are you?" There was an expression of terror on Mary's pretty face. "That's against the rules, and besides," he continued, "Mr. Marigold has been nothing but lovely to the staff and the other patients. His wife called. She's coming to visit tomorrow. You're on the schedule for tomorrow, aren't you?" "Yes, sir," Mary said, cringing. "I'd like you to be the one who escorts Mr. Marigold to the visitation room tomorrow. Mrs. Marigold is a lovely woman. I believe you haven't met her yet, and I believe you have escorted other patients to the visitation room before. Have you not, Mrs. Danvers?" "Yes, sir." "But you've never escorted Mr. Marigold. You'll find he's very docile, and he won't be flinging any feces at you or anybody else because the orderlies have a very good friendship with him. If I hear you make another remark about Mr. Marigold, then I'll have you help the orderlies change his diapers for a month. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir, I understand," Mary chirped. The terror of obedience made her features suddenly childish. She was embarrassed to be reprimanded in front of her co-workers, who were in an awkward silence of their own out of second-hand embarrassment. Mary met Mr. Darwin Marigold in the lounge that afternoon, after she had her chicken Alfredo leftovers, something which Darwin Marigold hadn't had since his unfortunate transfiguration. She didn't know it, but he could smell it on her breath. It was the cause of his smile while they were seated at the checkerboard. Checkers was Mr. Marigold's favorite pastime, even though his skill was in a laughable decline. All the other patients zombied around in harmless but uncoordinated choreography that hour, while Mary purposefully let Mr. Marigold win. She found the length of his brown fingers unnerving, as well as his barnyard musk. She felt like She was looking into the eyes of the ghost of a dead pet whenever he looked at her when it was her turn. Occasionally, he'd get confused which color his checker piece was, and he would move Mary's checker piece instead. She rectified this, trying to shroud her annoyance with sympathy. She did feel a little sympathy for him, but he also unnerved her so. It unnerved her to know that the chimpanzee sitting across from her used to be a man, and this fact settled itself cancerously the next day when Mrs. Marigold came to visit. "Darwin," the woman in the purple crochet sweater cooed, "don't you recognize me?" Her face was pale enough for some of the orderlies to mistake her for one of the patients, but she had the perfume of the outside world on her. Perfumes from department stores, cinnamon toothpaste, real life. "Darwin, honey." The woman tilted her head, but the chimpanzee just made an O shape with his lips at her. "I was going through the closet yesterday and went through some of your shirts and suits. Do you remember how I'd help you tie your ties? Or remember some of those times I'd shave for you? We'd stand in front of the bathroom mirror, and I'd shave your face for you. I still think about that." Mary Danver stood over the shoulder of the chimpanzee. She tried not to look into Miss Marigold's watery eyes. Was it guilt she felt? Was she still annoyed about being put on Marigold's case? Yes, but it felt like something more, too. "I think he remembers," Miss Marigold said with a sorrowful delight, still looking into the chimpanzee's beady eyes. Yes, I know he does. I can see it in his eyes. He knows me." Mary doubted this, but she wouldn't say so. She wouldn't even cringe, though she wanted to. "I think about the kiss we shared on our wedding day." Miss Marigold's voice quivered. "You have to remember that." She looked up at Mary with the slippery hope in her eyes, her pupils like black ice. "Has he been responsive? Is my Darwin showing any signs of humanity?" He plays checkers. I'm new to his case, but his charts say he used to read books when he was admitted, but we haven't seen him read anything for the last 2 or 3 weeks." Mary tried to sound assuring, her voice failing. She watched the woman slip on her own sense of hope. She watched her face shudder into an expression of despair. "Humanity?" Miss Marigold asks. "My husband's human." Mary couldn't help it. At first, her cheeks puffed out, but that didn't work, so she turned away and spat out in laughter. She slapped her hand over her mouth. "Human!" Mrs. Marigold screamed, her eyes scrunching together. "My husband is human!" Darwin Marigold started making hooting sounds that slowly went up in volume. "You're upsetting him," Mary insisted. She still had a smirk on her face. Mr. Marigold's hooting increased, and some of the orderlies appeared to guide him back to his room. Mary stayed behind for a little bit to try and comfort Mrs. Marigold, but she struggled holding in her laughter. Mary would take Darwin for walks outside around the perimeter of the Institute. He'd hold his arm up to hold her hand and waddle beside her. His face revealed some semblance of enjoyment while he led her around outside. She didn't like the roughness of his hand, how delicate her hands felt in his. She'd think about what she had read in his chart whenever they went out for their daily walks, and how there was no information on just how Darwin Marigold had turned into a chimpanzee. What she did know was that Darwin acted very human-like at first. sitting down at the kitchen table in his house. He even tried to shave himself in the bathroom mirror. That was when Mrs. Marigold first discovered what had become of her husband. She saw a chimpanzee standing there and holding her husband's razor with shaving cream foam all over his snout, the nose and the mouth now shaped like an oval bowl. Out of curiosity, Mary had looked up the police calls on the internet. How Mrs. Marigold screamed and cried, "My husband's turned into a chimp! Please, you have to come quick! He's trying to shave!" Mr. Marigold was appearing to show a sense of kinship with Mary as the days went on. When it was time for their daily walks, he'd stand there and hug her leg while she cooed, "Come on, Darwin, don't you want to go for your walks?" He wanted to hug her. He wanted company. He wanted something, or maybe he just didn't want anything. His skills at checkers declined until Mary gave up even playing with him anymore. In fact, the head psychiatrist had actually diagnosed Mr. Marigold with depression because he started displaying a reluctance for his daily walks. He started showing a propensity for wanting to spend all day sitting in his bed. Mary would clock in and come to see the chimpanzee, sitting with his knees to his chest on the bed. How similarly he looked to a catatonic prisoner. Seeing him in that monkeyish position reminded Mary of the infamous Russian sleep experiment photo, and it started to make her dislike Mr. Marigold even more. She only walked him up and down the institute hallways. She was always embarrassed to bring him into the boys' bathroom when the dopey hoots of the other patients that hid in the stalls would surround them. One day, Mr. Marigold got angry at his own reflection, and the orderlies had to come and put him in his room. Another time, one of the male patients tried to hug Mr. Marigold, and it irritated him violently again, but the situation was quelled when they put him back in his room. Mrs. Marigold kept coming to visit, but she wasn't visiting her husband anymore. She was visiting a chimpanzee. She cried every time. Mr. Marigold never did. There were brief instances in her visits when he might have recognized his wife, but every instant always devolved into him just zoning out. "Good morning, Mr. Marigold," Mary greeted him one morning when entering his room. He was sitting on the bed in his usual position. She crept forward. "Want to go get some breakfast?" It was unprovoked. Mr. Marigold propelled himself off the bed and onto Mary's face. She didn't have time to scream. The impact of him jumping on her sent her falling backwards into the room and out into the hallway. Chimpanzee shrieks echoed down the hall before any screaming started. But the screaming did come, and the screaming and the chimpanzee shrieks made such a hideous duet. Mr. Marigold had started by beating his fist onto Mary's shoulders and collarbone. She closed her eyes. She turned her face away so that her cheek touched the floor. And that was when Mr. Marigold's dirty fingernails dug into the side of her face. Her screams blasted out when he ripped a flab of skin off, like the fatty tissue of a roasted turkey. Her screams were sharp. Mr. Marigold shrieked and hooted, as if annoyed by those screams. He pummeled his fist down a couple of more times on her chest, his fists bouncing off the bra under her blue scrubs, and then he went back to ripping at her face. He bent down and nibbled on the exposed muscle. So much of her face had been removed that she felt his teeth scrape against her molars, scrape against her gums. She screamed and cried again and again. Orderlies and security guards shuffled down the hall, but Mr. Marigold had already taken out one of Mary's eyes. He popped it into his mouth and chewed, the veins swinging from his lips. He seemed to be smiling while Mary cried. Why, half of Mary's face was smiling too. Mr. Marigold was put back in his room. He got back into bed, returned to his sitting position while chewing on Mary's eye, as if it were nothing but a piece of bubble gum. He chewed while Mary cried in the hallway, with half of her face just gone. The damage couldn't fully be seen, because her face was a flood of blood. I'm one of the orderlies who rushed into the hallway that day. I don't like to remember how she cried up at the ceiling, as if crying would repair her face. I admit I froze above her. I'd had a crush on Mary for years. I was always too afraid to tell her or ask her out, but that day, when the other orderlies and I stood over her, I was sick to my stomach. I hate to admit this, but I was grossed out. Mr. Marigold is still at the Pumpkin Patch Institute. He hasn't thrown any other tantrums. In fact, he's very well behaved now. I take him for walks sometimes. His violence on Mary Danvers actually seemed to have improved his mood. He likes the sunshine. He likes it when he sees Mary Danvers. He smiles at her whenever he sees her. That is who he recognizes more than his wife. Oh, I think Mrs. Marigold is coming today. What do you say? Want to go back inside, Mr. Marigold? My eyes slowly opened. The soft, slightly sticky warmth of my modest one-bedroom apartment hung like an oppressive reminder that I, as an unemployed and nearly penniless tenant, couldn't afford to turn on my air conditioning. I'd fallen asleep in a slump against the old brown leather couch in the living room. Again. I groaned as my body shifted into place, stretching my legs and arms about, feeling them wake up as I did. July in Georgia is not forgiving, and it certainly took no prisoners. The hours I had whittled away, I spent largely just laying around, hoping my email notification would go off regarding a potential job. This cycle had been ongoing for about a week or two, and honestly made time seem even more warped. My mind berated me. Was I doing enough? Should I be burning through my very nearly non-existent savings like this? I shouldn't be picky. I should just go get whatever job I can. Beggars can't be choosers, you know. Attempting to shake off the mental fog, I got up quickly from the couch, walked over to the mini-fridge against the adjacent wall, and took out an ice-cold soda. Placing the cold can against my head, I sighed, having momentary relief and trying to reassure myself that I was making the right decision. I deserve the right job. I have the experience. I have the skill set. I shouldn't just settle. One of these opportunities will pan out. I just know it. Feeling a renewed sense of vigor, I turned to my phone, charging on the tablet that sat beside the couch. I nabbed it up and looked at the screen to see the time, 4:37 p.m., and nothing else but my screensaver, some generic mountain range captured at dusk that always made me feel nostalgic for a place I'd never been. I let out another sigh and glanced around the space, the warm living quarters, and thought about how to kill the rest of my day. That's when I heard it, outside my apartment window. A lady's voice, fairly young, exuberant, happy, slightly wrong. "I see you, peekaboo, I see you," she said. Sounded like she was talking to a kid, maybe even a baby. I was half tempted to pull back the curtains and scan the lawn to see, but I thought If she was there and some weird dude started staring at her, well, that'd be awkward. I'm not overly familiar with my neighbors in the apartment across the way, but I'd never seen a kid or a baby, and I'd never heard a voice like that before. To a normal person, you'd think, why is a lady talking to a baby weird? And you know, I'd agree with you, but I'd spent too much time indoors with nothing but my own mind to keep me company. And I'm sure you can guess that leads to heightened anxiety. Christopher, get a hold of yourself, dude. Spent too many days sitting in this apartment, moping around. Now, some lady's talking to a baby, and it's got you freaked out. I let out a chuckle at myself for being stupid. What a dumbass. I cracked the soda open and took a gulp, letting the carbonation and sugar simultaneously burn and soothe my throat. I let out a hearty ah afterwards, and it seemed to amuse me. I finished the soda and another 2 gulps, walked over to the trash can situated near the sink, and chucked it in. Walking back into the living room, I noticed there was no longer any game of peekaboo being cooed outside my window, and all had returned to normal and uninteresting silence. With that, I turned my attention back to my phone, deciding I would manually check my emails. Sometimes the notifications didn't always work as intended, and I was desperate for some sign of forward momentum. As I placed my finger over the email icon on my home screen, the exuberant, joyful, and even a little warped voice rang out again. "I see you! Peekaboo, I see you!" This time it wasn't coming from behind me, beyond the curtained window. It was coming from my porch, right behind my front door. I stared in confusion in that direction. What in the hell? I could feel anxiety, anxious energy surging through my body. My mind wasn't sure how to process the voice or what was happening. Why is the voice at my door? Why does it sound like that? Tried to quickly rationalize it. Maybe she was waiting for a friend across the way. The Carolwoods, I think. Maybe she's friends or family or something. It's hot, and she's got her baby and is trying to keep him calm or entertained. My brain was rooting around, trying to red yarn its way to some conclusion that made the voice that was now just past my front door less out of place, less strange. "Get it together," I said. Then it hit me. I was dramatizing a situation because I was bored and not very productive. Of course, duh, I chuckled again at my own stupidity. I'm going to go to my room and watch TV. The fan blows better in there anyway, and I'll be away from the ladies' annoying blabbering. I'm not scared. I'm just annoyed, that's all. I lied to make myself feel less like a wuss who was evading a strange scenario and more like someone who was choosing to avoid an obnoxious situation. I sat up and quickly walked down the hall, the ladies disorderly, joyful, and robotic "I see you" fading away. Upon entering my modest room, which housed a bed, a sofa chair, a small closet, and a smaller bathroom, I shut the door and, out of some animal-born sense of security, I locked it. I plopped down in the sofa chair and quickly booted up my TV and launched Netflix. I was paranoid about nothing. I knew that, but stranger things have happened, and I wasn't going to assume I was safe. Despite not being able to hear the lady anymore, I cranked the volume over my usual listening threshold. I sat back and began to watch a documentary on panda preserves. Before I knew it, my eyes had grown heavy and my body and mind had given themselves over to sleep yet again. Sometime later, I jolted awake, the dark room and the TV off due to its power save setting. What had woken me was the soft pulsation of my phone as it vibrated. The caller ID read, Mom. I stared at it, half out of grogginess, half out of cowardice. Do I want to talk to her? Or, as it usually goes with my mother, do I want to be talked at by her? I decided against answering. I was already feeling annoyed at myself enough. I didn't need a good old dogpiling from my mother to top it all off. Plus, I had to pee. God, did I have to pee. I got up and hustled the few short steps into the connecting bathroom, flicked on the lights, and as I was about to unbuckle my pants, from past the door to my bedroom came the voice. It was the lady's voice. Joyful, sweet, energetic, loud, and very, very wrong. I see you! Peekaboo! I see you! There was no denying it now. The voice sounded human, but it wasn't. It was slightly warped, as if the edges of it were being warped, as if the mouth forming them was too misshapen to form them right, as if the voice projecting them was doing its best to mock it. My mind raced. This seemed unbelievable. This was absolutely less than 3 feet away, inside my apartment. Why was it doing this to me? I blinked hard and gathered what resolve I had. It didn't matter what or why this was happening. It just was. And I could safely conclude that whatever it was intending to scare me, or worse, to hurt me. I had my phone. I could call 911. That was step 1. Step 2, I had a baseball bat in my closet. I grabbed that and ready myself. Step 3, I had a small window that dropped down into the courtyard. It was on the 2nd floor, but I could manage the jump. I think. That's all I could think to do. With all the bluster and bravado I could muster, I quickly moved to the sofa chair and grabbed my phone, and made my way to open the closet and grab the bat, all in a few swift movements. All the while, the lady was cooing the same phrase over and over again on a loop, no more than 5 feet away. I wrestled with the lock on the bedroom window. It wasn't playing nice. I didn't think I'd ever opened it in the 4 years that I'd lived here, and it obviously hadn't been opened long before then. After struggling with the latch for what felt like eternity, it gave way. Then it proceeded to push up on the window. Luckily, it went flying up without much resistance, and as I pushed it up, it made a hard slamming sound. As if on cue when that happened, the chanting from the lady outside the door stopped. It was dead silent. The only discernible sound was my breathing, the night air flowing in and bringing with it the sounds of crickets and cicadas. I sat by the open window, wide-eyed, staring directly into the dinky lit room and laser-focused on the bedroom door. From beneath the door frame, an impossibly long arm silently began to stretch in. Skin pale, almost blue in the light, vascular, the fingers long, bony, and dressed in rings against their bulking knuckles. The fingernails, longer still and adorned in crimson polish that almost seemed to glow in the drearily lit bedroom. The impossibly long arm effortlessly stretched up until its index finger touched the lock on the doorknob, as if waiting just a beat to heighten the tension. It clicked the lock. The door was unlocked. This lady could swing the door open, and whatever it was could cross the threshold into the room and come for me. I had to jump, the risk of breaking my leg be damned. I didn't want to see what ghoulish visage that arm belonged to. I steeled my nerves and jumped the 12 or so feet to the grassy courtyard below. I landed with a hard thud, but I didn't lose my balance. My adrenaline rushing, I made a hasty dash towards the center of the small complex. My legs were firing like pistons. I gunned it to the nearest light source, which happened to be a small gazebo. Then my fight-or-flight responses loosened enough for me to think, I gotta call the cops. As I approached the small structure, which was bathed in a harsh and singular white light, I pivoted to look back at my apartment window. No hand, no creature, no nothing. Just an open window. But what could I expect to see? Some ghoulish, haunting leer that came from the darkened opening? Some unholy visage, all teeth and elongated appendages, coaxing me back? What was going on with me? Was I having some sort of breakdown? Had the stress and the loneliness gotten to me? That was certainly a better explanation than what I was thinking was happening, right? I sighed, plopped down hard on the only bench housed under the gazebo, and unlocked my phone. I had a notification, an email. I knew no matter, now wasn't the time. I needed to call the police. I needed to make sure my apartment was clear. If I was having a mental breakdown, I could get help. I needed this, whatever it was, to be over. But, you know, that often unseen hand that guides us to make the most inane decisions at the wrong moment? Yeah, that one. That force propelled me to click on the email notification. God damn it, I wish I hadn't. It took me to a video. The video was dark, quiet, as if nothing was even playing, but then a loud static and the sounds of hands fumbling around as the frame was jilted and shook. And then, as if lit with a small and barely effective flashlight, a mouth plastered with a wry grin appeared. But, as with the voice, it was wrong. It was too wide, with far too many small teeth. The lips were thin and smeared with crimson lipstick, the same shade as the fingernails I'd seen just a moment ago. Then it began to move, to speak. I see you, peekaboo. I see you. I felt my body flush with fear, confusion, anger. What the hell was happening? I tried to exit. I tried shutting my phone's power off, but nothing worked. I instinctively and forcefully dropped the phone. The mantra was on a disturbing repeat. The lady's joyous and warped voice, a disgusting lullaby I had to get away from. Whatever ungodly force had decided to visit me was breaking the bounds of reality and anything I understood. Neighbors, my mind yelled at me, go to the Carolwoods, ask to use their phone, call 911, figure this shit out, go! I spurred myself into action, running out from beneath the gazebo and towards the other two-story apartment complex, directly across from mine. Navigating the dimly lit walkway up to their door, I didn't have concern for etiquette or what time it was. I was in pure self-preservation mode. I knocked on their door as loud as I could. What's the wife's name? Denise, Desiree, something with a D. I simultaneously scolded myself while trying to recall the woman's name. Her husband, who I'd only met once in passing, was a complete stranger. Before I could deliberate any further, the porch light popped on and a voice from behind the door wavered out at me. It was a man, the aforementioned husband. What the hell do you want? I'm so sorry to bother you, Mr. Carolwood, but someone broke into my house and I don't have my cell and I'm worried. I need to call the cops. I live across the way in Unit 17. He cut me off. Yeah, Christian, right? He said, his tone less unsure and worried and now more curious than annoyed. Christopher, I responded back hurriedly while throwing another glance at my apartment unit. Another voice, quieter, came out from behind him. A woman. Christopher, honey? Yeah, you sound scared. Let me get you some help. Thank God, Buddha, Shiva, Elvis, who the fuck ever. I sighed. I felt a wave of uncertain hope wash over me. The door unlatched and swung open to reveal a dark opening, one that seemed to stretch into a void. There was no one there. No Mr. Carrollwood. No Mrs. Carrollwood. Just a dark hallway, and a voice that loudly reached from just beyond its bounds. I see you, peekaboo. I see you, Christopher. As quickly as I had felt hope, I felt my body give itself over to absolute terror. I spun around and attempted to run, but that long, pale blue arm, the one with its nails adorned in a bright, glowing crimson polish, had wrapped its unnatural fingers all the way around my calf. I fell hard on the "We're so glad you're here" welcome mat that decorated the front porch of the Carrollwoods. I managed to turn my body around to see the arm that was pulling me into the void. I couldn't see the creature it was attached to. I didn't want to. I needed to fight. I needed to get loose. But I was being dragged by force so strong, any attempt I made to swing my bat or kick was met with pure indifference. This is it, my mind raced. My heart thrashed inside my chest so hard I felt like I'd have a heart attack or worse, die of fear. I swung the bat. I yelled. I cursed. It was no use. I was being drawn into the maw of this entity, this being, this thing. I'd shut my eyes and waited to die. I stopped moving. I didn't feel the hand on my leg anymore. I felt warm. I jolted awake. I was in my apartment. The sticky heaviness of the room, just as it had been hours before. The golden light from the afternoon poured in through what cracks it could. What the hell? I thought. Did I just dream that? As I straightened my stiff and slightly aching body up and coming to grips with the absolute deja vu, a voice rang out from down the hall, this time slow and loud, and just past the threshold of my sight. Peekaboo, I see you. Ever since I was little, death was a next-door neighbor. I mean, literally right next door. I could look out the window and see it. I could watch through my bedroom window as Mom walked towards it. Every day, she would wake up before the sun and make her brisk walk to work. It took me a long time to discover what she did, and even longer to understand it. She would pry bodies apart and put them back together, prettier than they were when they arrived. They arrived in dark vans, bruises all over their bodies, and they would leave with eyeliner and makeup. That's where I learned that one can measure life in shades of purple, whether it be bruises or makeup. Measured, mind you, not defined. So naturally, that's where I saw my first body. I'd try to sneak in now and then, and I guess I was never successful. Mom always thwarted me, but eventually, I just wore her down. It was too much being the mortician and the security guard. So there he was, a fairly innocent death. He looked so natural, but just a little less. I always thought I would take after Mom, and for a while I was on track to. I'm not even sure how I got sidetracked. I enjoyed making Mom's job look nice. She always kept it so dour, and I had wanted to spruce up the place. I felt fulfilled when it all came together, and I felt like I normally do, just a little more. I did it for my house, then I did it for my mom, my friends, my neighbors, and before I even knew what was happening, I was trying to convince people to buy a house. My houses sold, and people took notice of how I put them together. I guess, if I were to be poetic, that's how I took after Mom. I took these houses, the remains of them, and dolled them up as best I knew how. I made it look nice. so nice that you'd never know it was dead at all. For a long time, I thought that when people died, that was it. No ghosts, no heaven or hell. It was a snap, and you were just gone. Like a house. When the furnace goes out, when the walls rot away, and the spider webs consume every window, I thought the house was gone. I know now that's wrong. Despite working with my mom for many years, I never entertained the notion of ghosts. It wasn't until the house on Wilbur Street that I changed my mind. I won't go into too much detail, but that house was its own beast. And if it weren't for a strange but generous buyer, it might have been the end of my career. It was a weed, though. Something that sprouted in me, unwelcome but beautiful nonetheless. A world you might not have ever heard of. A world that probably, if not for what I'm telling you now, you would likely go your whole life without knowing about. In the housing market, there exists a small but dedicated sect reserved for the enigmatic influential, or even the nefarious. I'm talking about the buying and selling of houses that have, in one way or another, been deemed haunted. Just like any realtor, I'll get my hands on a house sometimes. Sometimes I find it myself, sometimes it's offloaded by a larger realty company. Regardless, I'll go in, make the house look as nice as possible, just like I would with any other house. That was before I discovered this unofficial and morbid market. Unlike an unafflicted house, however, I would research and experiment. With enough research, I can gather information on who perished within the house and the cause of death. I also need to be mindful of people who lived in the home but had relocated, as spirits can travel back to where their emotions were the strongest, like a magnet pulling in metal sand. After gathering the information, I conduct my small experiments. The severity and nature of the haunting need to be distinguished and defined before I can even list the house. Something you might not know about most hauntings is how consistent they are. Sure, the activity will alter, but it will happen over and over. I've had houses you could set a stopwatch by. I use a marker to outline cups and dishes in order to check if they've been pushed. I take pictures of each room every hour, on the hour, so I can meticulously comb through them. Something you may or may not know about typical hauntings is they can be boring. Rarely do you come across an outwardly aggressive home. And when you do, the type of people that buy those, it's not my place, but it's troubling to think about what they might want the home for. That's neither here nor there, though. Haunted homes sell to many people. You have eccentrics and ghost hunters who want a place for entertainment. There are people who practice the dark arts, though you can typically sniff out the wannabe types. There are even people who just really need a home and try to get a cheaper deal. Depending on the haunting and its interest, sometimes they do. You have to call it a loss at some point and lower the price just below market value. That's how you do it. That's what this house was, I thought. Another suburban home I was going to take a hit on. Boy, was I wrong. Of course, that's how tales like these come to be. If I was right, if all I ever saw was a coffee mug move across the counter, then you'd never hear a peep out of me. The house was on Carter Avenue. If you don't know which Carter Avenue out of the hundreds that likely exist, then yes, you're not meant to. I got it for a bargain from my peer because, well, it was a house that nobody had high expectations for. There wasn't a history of violence or any mention of the occult, just a younger couple that passed away in their sleep. Carbon monoxide leak. To me, though, the house was lovely, if not for a small string of reported activity. The house could have been sold on its merits. It was in a quiet neighborhood. Everything looked new and had been taken care of. It was a picture of suburban living. So I hedged my bets and thought I would just make the house look like a proper home for anyone looking to buy. It took a while, an uncomfortable amount of time, before I'd got a bite. While I toiled away looking through photos of the house's bedroom, my phone buzzed. It was a buyer. A young couple looking to buy their first home. The woman on the phone beamed about starting a family of their own. So we set up a date to meet, and I plunged further into Carter Avenue. As bizarre as it is to say, I wanted to make sure the haunting was child-friendly. No loud noises or aggressive movements, you understand. For the most part, though, the house was quiet. Sure, there were signs, but the haunting was so mellow you'd never know it if you weren't looking for it. A slight push that would move a cup from its outline, pictures on the wall that would go askew, and a penny was even pushed off the counter. That was all, so, just enough. It was just enough activity for it to make the difference between haunted and natural occurrence. Maybe I should have had my wits about me in that regard. Though I know, when I offer myself grace, there's no way I could have known it was anything other than a run-of-the-mill haunting. The day of the showing plays in my head from time to time. I always go back to when I was starting down the hall. It was right before the couple was supposed to show up. I stopped at the top of the stairs and looked down the hallway. It led to all the bedrooms and had light bleeding in from each. The sun was gentle and warm. It created a vignette in the hall. At the end of the hall there was a picture hanging above a small table, decorated with various books and a small fern. The picture was an oil painting, a stark mixture of black and white. Upon seeing it initially, you'd assume it was nonsense, a Rorschach test of sorts. If you took the time to soak it in, though, at least for me, I made out the picture. It almost always looked like an animal, with a wide-open jaw, a howl of anguish. Once I made out the mouth, the rest followed suit. Maybe the face was meant to be beautiful, but it looked straight out of hell to me. It felt crooked. It, however, was a painting in the home that the haunting hadn't affected. To the naked eye, the painting was perfectly straight, lined right up to the surface of the table under it, but it felt crooked. I could feel the painting making one side of my head heavier, craning my neck as if trying to see it from a new angle. The hall itself felt as though it was stretching out, pulling the details of the painting further and further away from me. The once warm vignette ignited from the room, turning into static with the tunnel. So it shouldn't come as a shock when I say I nearly jumped out of my skin when I heard the front door shut. My arms rushed to my chest as if guarding me from an incoming attack. Even without my hands actually on my skin, I could feel my heart smacking around inside. A few breaths in and out calmed me, and I gathered my senses. I quickly rushed down the stairs and spotted the couple, Sandra and Owen Welling. The door had startled me, but I'd informed them upon their arrival that they could just come in, as the house wasn't exactly booked for tours. Bounding down the stairs, I immediately started in with the pleasantries. They looked as normal as can be. The woman was a blonde, her hair just barely touching her shoulders. The man looked tired, almost like he had headed straight to the home from work. His brown hair haphazardly swooped to one side. I couldn't help but notice he was sheepish, letting the woman take the lead and speaking up very little. Admittedly, this annoyed me. They were a couple, and while every dynamic is different, I found it odd that he had so little interest in where he might build a family. It happened, though, and swung both ways. Suppose it's nothing more than a pet peeve, but it did inform me to pay more attention to the wife. So, with her trailing closely behind me, we toured the lower floor. It felt almost like it used to, showing off regular homes. The activity in the house was so sparse that I'd rarely stop to talk about it. In the kitchen, I informed them that it's best to leave cups and dishes a respectful distance from the edge. In the dining room, I informed them that sometimes they could hear a knocking on the floor above. The knocking noise was not audible from anywhere else in the house, which is probably the most peculiar haunt in the home, but it's harmless. She asked questions here and there, but it wasn't until we began to ascend the stairs that she started delving deeper. In the first bedroom, she asked me who the previous occupants had been. I told her it was a young couple, though I only knew their names. We sometimes find photos left behind by the previous occupants, but this time, especially with younger folks, the families affected will snatch up photos before I even get my hands on the house. It might seem odd that I don't go too deep into the lives of those who are supposedly haunting the grounds. I did early on. I'd familiarize myself with their faces and history, but I found that doing so would cause a confirmation bias. I would see faces where there might not have been one, or I'd pick up smells related to the previous death and assume it was paranormal, when it could just be a clogged drain. The woman stalled for a moment and rested her hand on the doorframe. I could only see her back. The sun beaming through the windows wrapped a glow around her thin figure. "It's cold." I hardly heard the words when she spoke them. They were distant, like they were afraid to leave the room. She was right, though. It was cold, and noticeably so. The house was monitored for temperature variations, but nothing so severe. The skin on my arms prickled. I thought the cold would have made me shiver, but after taking in the new chill, I realized my pocket was buzzing. I ignored it, realizing the man had drifted out of sight, though only barely. He stood in the hall, looking at the same painting that had mesmerized me earlier. "This would make a great nursery," the woman said, her voice louder this time, but still distant. I was watching the man, though, his arms sheepishly jostling from side to side like he was fidgeting with something. A tension had built in my chest, partially from the cold gripping my lungs. Reaching into my pocket, I quickly retrieved the phone, intending to ignore the call as the vibrating was audible. "Oh, absolutely. It's great for sunlight in the mornings," I replied, glancing at her as I spoke. I glimpsed the same silhouette before returning to my phone's touchscreen, and just like the painting had before, the illuminated screen stole my attention. I couldn't have been more than a minute, though. Despite how long it felt, the clock in the upper right corner didn't change. An incoming call. The sensation of the phone rattling in my hand acted as a warning bell, a siren of things to come. Incoming call from Sandra Wellings. The words couldn't have felt heavier in my hands. Her voice, when I picked up the phone, couldn't have been louder in my head. I listened to the woman on the other line apologizing. She was embarrassed. They had fallen asleep on the couch and had no alarm set. She was asking me if they could still come by or if I wanted to reschedule. A reply, no matter how desperate I was for it, did not come, and as Sandra continued bidding for my attention, I could only look down the stretching hallway. In the deserted hallway, the only object present was the small white plastic dish and 2 batteries lying nearby. Suddenly I became horrendously aware of the figure that was in the doorway. I couldn't see her as I started down the hall, but God, could I feel her. Her presence felt so stifling, I thought I might fall through the floor. A soft whimper of denial weaseled its way up my throat. It felt like I was being told a story, or rather it felt like a story I'd already known, but that had been pushed deep down. This was someone else's story, a story of a death much more sinister than the public knew. This would be a great room for a nursery, the figure spoke, and as if those words manifested, I could feel strands of hair drop on the side of my face. She must have been as tall as she felt, hunched over with her head pressed against the ceiling, dark strands hanging like stalagmites. She wanted me to look. I could feel it. Her gaze fixed on me and burned holes through my scalp. Closer and closer. I could feel her warm breath wafting on the side of my face. The smell was more noticeable, though, or rather the lack thereof. I could only watch the painting, the hallway, once again tunneling as I pondered if it was safer to look at her or ignore her. Hauntings could get bad. Yes, even this bad. I've experienced little myself, but this wasn't my first time, though my heart still bumped like it was. When the retching began, the decision to focus on the hallway became one that I picked. A guttural and whining scrap lurched from the woman, though. It sounded like pulling marbles down from metal tubing, and after a moment something spilled from her mouth. I could hear small thuds smacking the ground, one after another. Once again, the sound reminded me of marbles. Then she was gone. I released the breath that had been held down as her weight lifted off me, allowing my skin to loosen. Looking down, they were all splayed out at my feet. They must have rolled around quite a bit after hitting the floor. A portrait drawn with AA batteries, a tale of heartbreak, scored by the chiding of a baby. A soft whine, much softer than the woman's. That room really does get so much sun. It had rested such a lovely glow on the crib inside. I could hear the baby crying from within it. I'm sure I could have heard it from anywhere in the house. It was ethereal, something I couldn't escape. It echoed through the walls and bounced around the room as I took my first step inside. The batteries around my feet shuffled aside and rolled, clattering against one another. A game of electric billiards. The sound of the baby crying became less defined with each step I took, its cries being pulled further through the veil. The white wooden slats of the crib ceased to be an obstacle, and I could peek over the edge. I didn't intend to step further. The bile was already churning. The sides of the crib acted like a dam for the wet, sticky mess inside. All that white was painted freshly red, a crimson that glistened in the sun. My legs gave out, and I crashed to the floor. The hardwood vibrated on impact. I felt my throat choke and scratch. Burning came afterwards in intervals. I was getting air, never catching my breath. A burning rose in my chest, nails dragging. Looking down at my shirt, I could see long dark lines running along my skin, like aged scratch marks. "I'm sorry," I whispered, cowardly, pensive. Looking up, he was lying on the floor, the boyfriend, the man. He was clawing at his chest, and his body writhed. The veins in his eyes crept towards the pupils like vines. His eyes rolled up, his gaze reached far above his head. This mess of a man, he was watching her, so scared of her now. She was looming over me again. All her hate and grief sat like a ball in my neck. All her unbridled horror wrapped around me, and I felt it. I could feel the hot, stinging tears running down my cheek. All that horror, waking up in the middle of the night, feeling how weak your body is. She must have known, or maybe she saw him taking them out. He probably told her he was replacing them. A depth of despair I could only understand when I looked into her eyes. Dying, knowing the life inside of you would follow. I thought truly that her face would be horrific, a mangled mess of bones and flesh, red and pulse. Horrific indeed, but there was no blood, just tears. The streams disobeying gravity. They twisted around her face and slipped around the curves of her nose. Her very own soul, a Rorschach. Pain will paint our lives. It can shape the way we see things. It can change the feeling of a room. It can haunt the memories you once held dear. No matter how many times you try to paint over that pain, it's still there. And I felt it on my face that day, as a few of her tears relented, failing to mix with mine. I knew her more intimately than I knew myself. That's the real ghost, and I suppose it always will be. The pain. We locked eyes, and although I understood her, The fear did not subside. A part of me felt like if I moved, she would change. If I broke off the conversation, as it were, then I would see something worse. The pain was a mask, and I could feel whatever was under it was in torment. I still think about it sometimes. The man was there in all his horror, face beet red and swollen, his throat ravaged with claw marks as he gasped for air, feeling as though he was being suffocated, regretting the decision he had made, probably telling himself in his final moments that he could have just left, and he was right. Of course, he likely died thinking of himself, and that was a moment of solace for me, that in his last thoughts he realized just how stupid he was. Even as I heard his body writhe around, pudders of liquid spilling from his mouth, even as he smacked the floor with what little strength he had left, begging for mercy, I watched his face, long and black, curtain-like strands of hair cutting off my peripherals, so all I could see was her. I stared into her face, dread growing closer. My eyes started to lose focus as she looked down at me. Her face appeared to stretch away from me like it was retreating down a hallway. She moved further and further, the guttural sound from before echoing around the column of hair she created. It got louder, growing as she shrank. Before too long, her face appeared like a two-dimensional object in the distance, just her misery, hanging solitary in a museum. At that distance, the noise was suffocating. A chirp layered on top of 1,000 other chirps, till I couldn't stand it anymore, and my eyelids slammed shut. The noise halted then, and quiet returned. My breathing was deep and ragged, and after wrestling with the thought, I opened my eyes again. Staring down the hallway, I felt the phone in my pocket buzz. Reaching into it, I read that Sandra was trying to get a hold of me again. Only 3 minutes had passed since she called. Accepting the call, I heard her rambling. I only focused on what she was saying when she asked if I was showing other people around. The words came out before I thought about how to phrase them. I just asked, "Did you hear her too?" Sandra chimed that she had, but hung up when the baby started crying, as it was hurting her ears. She continued talking as I zoned out, hypnotized by the hallway once again. "The house isn't a fit for you," I cut her off, cold and direct. "This house was no place to raise a baby. Someone will buy it, but I won't sell it. A damn shame, too. The light coming in through the window at the end of the hall really livens up the place." The house was a small, 2-story affair, with white siding on the bottom floor and gray shingles on the top. 3 windows were facing the street, a large picture window, a small rectangular one above that, and another large window below it. I got out of my car and walked towards the door, knocking twice before it opened. A woman stood there, wearing a blue dress with her hair tied back in a bun. She had bright green eyes that seemed to sparkle when she saw me standing outside her house. "Hello," she said cheerfully. Her voice was soft, but carried well through the night air. "Hi, are you Miss Tanner?" She nodded. "Yes, I am." She smiled again and stepped aside so I could enter the house. It smelled odd inside. Not bad or anything like that, just strange, like old books and dust. "Please come in." I entered her living room. It wasn't much more than a couch and a coffee table, an end table with a lamp on it. That's all I really needed for a place to sleep. The walls were painted yellow, which looked nice against the dark furniture. The carpet was black and covered most of the hardwood floors. There was a small kitchen off to the side of the living room with a sink, a stove, and a fridge. Everything was clean and tidy. "Sorry for the mess," she said, while pointing to some boxes stacked in the corner. My husband died last year, and I just haven't had the time to get around to moving everything yet." "No problem. I don't mind sleeping in a bed of mess." She chuckled. "Well, if you want to put your things away, feel free. Just make sure not to take too long, since I have to leave in a few hours." "Okay, thank you." "You're welcome. I'll be right back." She disappeared down a hallway. As I looked around the room, I noticed something else odd about the house. The walls weren't straight. They bulged outward here and there like they'd been pushed from the inside out by someone, pushing their way through them. It was subtle enough that it didn't bother me at first, but as I looked closer, I realized that it wasn't just the walls. Every single surface in the entire house had these little imperfections, including the ceiling and the floor. I heard footsteps coming down the hall and turned to see Miss Tanner returning with 2 glasses filled with water. She handed me one and took a seat on the couch across from me. "So, what brings you out this way?" she asked as she sipped her drink. "I'm looking for a friend of mine. He went missing in the area about a month ago." "Oh, that's dreadful. What happened?" "He just vanished." I paused as I thought about how to explain. "He was staying in an abandoned hotel nearby and never came back. We think he might have gotten lost in the woods." She shook her head sadly. "That's awful. Is there any chance he survived? Maybe ran away somewhere?" "I don't know. I hope so." She sighed heavily and leaned back on the couch. "I'm sorry. I wish I could help you find him." We sat quietly for a few moments before she spoke up again. "I don't mean to pry, but are you sure he isn't still alive? Maybe he's hiding somewhere or something." "Well, maybe," I said hesitantly. "Do you have any idea where he might have gone?" "I'm not sure, but I have a hunch." She laughed softly and shook her head. "Well, let me know if you hear anything about him. I'll keep my ears open as well." "Thanks. I better get some sleep now," I said, standing up from the couch. "Of course. I'll show you to your room." I downed the glass of water and placed it on the table. Even that seemed crooked. "Thanks again for letting me stay here." "You're more than welcome. Please feel free to use anything in the kitchen if you need anything." "I will." I followed her down the hallway to a staircase leading to the second floor. At the top of those stairs was another hallway that led to 3 doors, one on each side and one at the end. She pointed to the door on the left. "That one's yours. No one else is staying this weekend, so other doors will be locked." She opened the door to my room and flicked a light switch. There was a dresser opposite the bed with a window above it, and a small bed with a nightstand next to it. The wall behind the bed was covered in posters of famous horror movies, slasher flicks mostly. "This should be all set up for you." She motioned towards the bed. "Make yourself comfortable. My room is on the 3rd floor if you need anything." "Thank you. I'll keep that in mind." She walked over to the door at the end of the hall and closed it behind her before disappearing into her own room. I took a look around my room before lying down on the bed. The sheets were clean and smelled nice, but I couldn't tell whether they'd been washed recently or not. As I got under them, I noticed something strange about them. They felt heavy, like they were weighted down on one side. When I tried to lift them up, they wouldn't budge. I rolled over on my back and pulled at them, but still no give. Something was definitely wrong with this place. I lay there staring at the ceiling for a while before drifting off into a deep but restless sleep. I woke up sometime later to a knocking on the other side of my door. I sat up and rubbed my eyes before standing up from the bed. "Who is it?" I called out, walking over the door. There was no answer. I unlocked the door and cracked it open. It was dark outside, but the moon was bright enough that I could see everything clearly. I stepped out into the hallway and saw nothing except darkness. "Hello?" I called again, but once again there was no response. "Is someone there?" I asked as I turned around slowly. I heard another knock from behind me, and spun around only to catch sight of Miss Tanner standing in the doorway to her room. Her hair had fallen loose from her bun and hung down past her shoulders. She was wearing a white tank top and blue pajama pants with red stripes down them. She looked like she was trying to hide herself by covering her face with her hands, which were pressed against her cheeks. "Miss Tanner?" She didn't say anything, continuing to stare at me with wide eyes. "Are you okay?" I asked as I approached her. She nodded, but kept her head down. What's happened?" I asked as I reached out to touch her shoulder. She flinched away from my hand and backed up until she hit the wall behind her. Then, without saying a word, she ran down the hallway and disappeared into the shadows. I stood there for several seconds, dumbfounded by what had happened. What the hell had I just witnessed? Was it real? Or was it just one of those dreams or hallucinations brought on by stress or exhaustion? I went back inside my room and locked the door behind me. I grabbed my phone from my pocket and checked the time. It was after midnight. I'd been asleep for hours. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the poster of Friday the 13th hanging on the wall above the desk. Why would Miss Tanner act like that? And why would she try to hide from me when I touched her? It made no sense. I sighed heavily and laid back down on the bed. I wanted to go back to sleep, but I knew I couldn't fall asleep now. Not until I figured out what was going on here. Maybe if I waited long enough, she'd come back out and explain herself. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because suddenly I was shaken awake by someone pounding on the door. "Wake up!" I jumped up from the bed and opened the door to find Miss Tanner standing in front of me, with her hands balled into fists at her side. "What's wrong?" "Get dressed. You have to leave right now," she said frantically as she began to pace back and forth. "Why?" "You don't know how dangerous this place is. Get your things and get out, now." "What are you talking about?" She stopped pacing and looked me dead in the eye. "The house is cursed." "What?" "It's haunted. There are spirits in this house." I laughed nervously and shook my head. "There aren't any ghosts here." "Then what do you call that thing you saw earlier tonight?" "I don't know what you're talking about," I lied. Was she talking about herself? "I'm not leaving until I get some answers." "Please, just go. If you stay here much longer, something bad will happen to you, just like your friend." "My friend?" "Just go," she yelled. She started running downstairs. "Wait," I shouted after her, but it was too late. She was already halfway up the steps before she turned around and glared at me. "Tell me what happened." "He died," she said simply. "How?" "They got him." "Who?" "The monsters." I blinked at her and tried to process what she was telling me. "Monsters?" "Yes, the monsters. They came through the walls and they took him away." "Are you insane?" I screamed at her. "There's no such thing as ghosts or monsters." She frowned at me and shook her head. "There are more things than just that." Then she pointed to the floor below us. "You need to leave right now before they come for you next." "I can't leave. My friend might be here somewhere. He could still be alive." She let out a frustrated sigh and walked over to the window. She pushed aside the curtains and looked outside. The moon was bright enough that I could see everything clearly. I followed her gaze out the window and saw nothing except for darkness. She pulled open the window and leaned out into the night air. "He's leaving," she called out into the darkness. I heard a low growl coming from what sounded like inside the walls. Miss Tanner slowly backed away from the window. Then, without warning, she fell backwards onto the ground. Her body hit the floor with a sickening crunch and didn't move again. I stood there, staring at Miss Tanner's broken form lying on the floor for several seconds, before turning around and sprinting down the stairs. The whole house began to creak and moan, and it appeared as if the walls were closing in on me. I ran past the kitchen and the living room, both of which appeared to be untouched, and headed towards the front door. The only light came from the moon shining through the windows of the hallway. As I approached the exit, I felt something grab hold of my shoulder and pull me back. I spun around quickly to see a figure standing in the shadows behind me. It was tall and thin, with oily skin and long black hair. Its face was covered by a mask made of human bones. I struggled against its grip, but couldn't break free. The walls looked as if they were melting, and more human bone-masked faces were emerging from all around me, surrounding me on all sides and closing in on me until I couldn't breathe. I reached out to touch one of them, but only grabbed hold of empty air. Then suddenly, I was dragged back through the walls, felt myself descending into that pitch-black abyss beneath me. I woke up gasping for breath and sat right up in bed. My heart was racing and my body was soaked with sweat. There was a loud bang on the door and I jumped out of bed. I unlocked the door and opened it slightly, just enough to see who was knocking. But when I did, I wasn't surprised to see Mrs. Tanner standing there with her hands balled into fists at her side. "Get dressed. You have to leave right now." The emergency alert on my phone went off with a shrill noise, repeating 3 times and vibrating angrily, just as I was bringing the last of my stuff into the cabin. I took the device out of my pocket and stared at it in disbelief for about a minute before realizing that I'd have to leave, only moments after arriving. My hands were shaking from the cold as I read through it again. Severe weather alert. Heavy snowfall in the Frontenac region is expected to begin tomorrow. 60 to 80 centimeters of precipitation. Not good. I realized the roads would be impassable by this time, the following day. That meant I would have to leave early the next morning to avoid being stuck on the road in the blizzard, but subsequently meant 0 ice fishing time for me. I'd be lucky to make it home before it started coming down in earnest. Moments later, messages started coming in from my 3 friends who had planned to join me. The group chat notification popped up on my phone as I opened it. "Matt, did you see the emergency alert about the storm? I guess the trip's off. What a bunch of crap." Ted, "OMFG, a generational storm is what they're calling it now. Looks like we'll have to postpone it a few weeks. I hope you didn't go through with your plan to go up a day early, Jay." Greg, "No kidding. What are the chances this blizzard hits on our ice fishing weekend?" I messaged back saying I understood we'd have to reschedule. I told them that I made the trip up alone, accompanying the message with forehead-slapping emojis. It sucks that I'll be stuck up here alone, I thought to myself. My dog Gibson pawed at my leg, and I smiled at her, feeling slightly reassured by her presence. "Yeah, you're right, Gibby. I'm not completely alone. At least I've got you here with me." After putting down a bowl of water and another containing kibble, my next priority was to start a fire in the small brick stove at the center of the main living area. There was wood stacked up in a neat pile next to it, and a small bag containing kindling which we'd brought with us in the summer and left behind. At first glance, it looked like a large enough stack, but I knew from experience I'd need twice as much as it appeared to make to get through the night, so I went outside to gather more from beneath the boathouse. The family cottage was a rustic one, to put it mildly. There's no running water, no electricity, and the cabin's poorly insulated. Perennially procrastinated repairs were needed in more than one place, including the floor beneath one bed which had partially collapsed, letting in slight trickles of cold air from outside. It was drafty, and I could hear the sound of mice which had made their way through the gaps, burrowing in the bedroom and finding their way into our old coats or sleeping bags or something that we'd left behind. I sighed as I lit the kerosene lamps which were scattered on wobbly tables around the main living area. There was something about having vermin in the cottage that set me on edge, but at least Gibson's presence would keep them at a distance. After filling the place with warm, flickering light from a half-dozen kerosene lamps, I felt a little better. There was reassurance in having fire, and I started working on making a big one in the stove that would keep me warm throughout the night. I loosely wadded up some newspaper and then stacked dry kindling on top, making a teepee. Over that, I added larger pieces of wood, until I had piled it to the ceiling of the small stove. Then I lit a strip of cardboard and held it up to the paper inside, catching it alight in several places, watching as it began to burn and then flared up in a bright white-orange glow. Holding my hands up to the fire, I watched it and warmed myself up. Eventually I took off my boots and my coat, the entire cottage getting a little toasty. There's no sense unpacking, I thought, taking a beer out of the cooler and opening it. I took a sip and couldn't help but grimace at the taste. I'd never tried the brand before, and I picked it up on recommendation. It was awful, and lukewarm to boot. Par for the course, considering the trip so far. Took out my phone and watched some Netflix while beer went flat beside me. I lifted Gibson up onto the futon with me so that she was off the floor and close to the fire where it was warm. Eventually I got bored of office reruns and called it a night, adding another log to the fire and reminding myself to wake up in an hour to keep it going. Pulling the futon even closer to the stove so that it was close to the fire as safety would allow, I curled up in my sleeping bag and drifted off into an uncomfortable slumber, constantly tossing and turning, trying to stay warm, but not really succeeding. I woke up to the sound of whining coming from Gibson's trembling form on the bed beside me. I was so cold that I was actually scared. My teeth were chattering uncontrollably, and I realized a few hours had passed. The fire had gone out completely, reduced to mere embers at the base of the stove. I put on my jacket and blew hot breath onto my fingers, pulling Gibson closer to me. She was shaking as well. My hands were trembling as I put more newspaper and kindling on the fire, blowing it into embers and hoping they would reignite. My lungs felt frozen, and my heart was beating fast, my skin prickling with pins and needles, turning it into a total numbness in my extremities. I'd never felt so cold in my life. I realized I was far beyond the weather forecast for tomorrow. It seemed like it was minus 30 degrees, and steadily dropping further. Terrified that I wouldn't be able to get my body temperature back up, my mind started racing, thinking of worst-case scenarios. If I couldn't stop shaking pretty soon, it would be impossible to start the fire again. I recalled that my truck was just outside, and I could get in there and start it up, turning on the heat until I felt warm again. The idea of getting out there and the truck refusing to start was too much to take, though. Considering the state of the beat-up old Ford, that seemed like a distinct possibility. So I continued stoking the fire, blowing on the precious few embers and adding more newspaper every so often until the tiny flame had begun to grow. I held my shaking hands up to the measly fire and added pieces of kindling sparingly, one by one, terrified of it going out again. Pulling Gibson closer, we shared each other's warmth, and I began to feel halfway human again. A sound came from outside the cabin suddenly, startling me and causing me to jump. My heart skipped a beat, then pounded faster and faster in my chest. A noise like fingernails being dragged along the siding could be heard from all around. Echoing in the small space, something was going from one end of the cottage to the other, attempting to get inside. Deep, guttural breathing could be heard, grunting and snorting, desperate as it scraped its talons along the boarded-up windows. Gibson began to whine, making high-pitched noises as she huddled closer to me, and I put my hands over her muzzle, muffling her sound. Was it a bear, I wondered? I realized I was holding my breath. I thought about the holes in the flimsy facade of the cabin, the spot beneath the bed where mice were getting in. I thought about the broken screen door and the wooden one behind that which needed to be replaced, almost falling off its rusty hinges. The entire cottage felt so frail and insecure all of a sudden, and I heard the loud noise of whatever that thing was, breathing heavily just outside, trying to get in. Maybe it was too cold out there even for it. The ground shook from the weight of the creature as it made its way around the cabin. I was so focused on it that I didn't notice the fire going out at first as it fizzled down to embers. I continued holding my breath until it was gone. Then I relit the fire, my shaking hands barely able to get it going again. Once it was burning hot, I didn't sleep anymore. I pulled Gibson close, and the two of us stayed up all night, watching the fire with wary eyes, taking occasional glances at the door. Even once we were both warm, we continued to shiver. When the sun came up, I didn't notice at first. It was dark in the cottage one minute, and then it was light. I blinked my eyes a few times and rolled out of bed, deciding I would waste no more time leaving. I was hoping the bear, or whatever had been outside the night before, was gone. Gibson was scratching at the front door, asking to be let outside to pee, which told me it was probably safe. In the light of the morning, all that had happened seemed to be a bad nightmare, and I told myself maybe it had been, till I got outside and saw the claw marks that marked the exterior wall. Shuddering, I threw my belongings in the truck, doused the fire with too much water, and took one last look at the place. What a weekend this had turned out to be, I thought to myself. With more people around, it would be easier to keep the fire going, taking turns feeding it with wood so that everyone could sleep through the night. But it was frightening being up here by myself, even with Gibson by my side. I'd never done it before in the winter, and I never would again. There were too many things that could go wrong. Freak snowstorm, a fallen tree blocking the road, getting stuck or going into a ditch, and those were just the beginning. I wanted to get out of here before any of those things happened. The truck didn't want to start at first. I turned the key in the ignition twice, hearing only the click of the absence of any engine noise. Cursing loudly, I checked to make sure I hadn't left the interior lights on or something which would drain the battery. Satisfied there was still a charge, I tried one more time, and finally the old shitbox let out a cough and kicked into life. The engine began to sputter before finally settling into a steady, rusted purr. "All right, Gibson, let's get out of here," I said, rubbing my dog's head and smiling as she blinked at me. She looked content in the front seat, happy to be back in the truck and out of the cold cottage. There was a thin layer of snow on the gravel road, and the tires moved easily enough. I looked up to see the sky was turning gray above us. A few snowflakes were just beginning to fall. The weather was making an early appearance. I turned on the radio, and sure enough, they said the same thing I was thinking. The storm would be arriving early. By noon, the highways would be a parking lot. Whiteout conditions. Be prepared to be trapped in your car. Have emergency services ready. My anxiety was through the roof as I went around a bend in the road. Hitting the gas, I came to the first big hill and went over it, seeing something strange up ahead as I came over the rise. Whatever it was blocking the road. Massive. Brown. The lumpy fur shape got bigger as I pulled up in front of it. The bear, which had been trying to get into my cottage the night before, was dead, lying in the middle of the gravel road and blocking it completely. First, I thought it had frozen to death. I got out of my truck and inspected it and was surprised to find there was a horrible smell coming from the carcass. It was a chemical smell, noxious and unpleasant, like some sort of factory waste. The snow had melted all around the beast, the blood and entrails pooling around the far side. What the hell could have done something like this? Aren't bears at the top of the food chain? Alpha predators? Gibson was by my side, but she didn't venture anywhere near the body. Usually she would have gotten curious, trying to sniff at it or something like that, but she stayed next to me, emitting a low growl. The road was completely blocked, I realized. There was no way out, not unless I could move it. No matter which way I attempted it, the giant body of the dead bear would not budge. It weighed a ton. There were large trees on either side of the road, so close to the driving path. There was only one way out, which was by driving across the frozen lake, and that was way risky. I hadn't been able to test the thickness of the ice yet. It would need to be nearly a foot deep for me to feel comfortable, but there was a clear way on and off the ice if it came down to it. I got back in the truck and threw it in reverse since there was nowhere to turn around. I felt sick to my stomach, nervous with anticipation and fear, uncertain of how things were going to play out. Once back in front of the cottage, I got out of the truck and went down to the ice with my spud. Walking out onto the lake, I cleared a spot with my boot and began to dig. I dug with the sharpened metal rod. Satisfied that I'd found the bottom of the ice, I put the tape measure through the hole, hoping it would be close to a foot. Looking at the tape measure, my heart sank. The ice was barely 7 inches thick, just below the minimum 8 inches where it would be safe to drive a vehicle across. My truck was on the heavy side, and I wouldn't feel comfortable unless it was a full foot thick. I pulled out my phone and checked for a signal, deciding it was time to call someone for help. Who would I call? I wasn't sure, but I knew I couldn't get out of this jam by myself. Of course, I muttered out loud, seeing the signal bars were down to 0, and the words "no service" were printed over the top of the screen. Surely I would have gotten another severe warning alert otherwise, because snow was now being dumped down on me from above, and the sky had turned nearly black with the approaching storm. I typed out a message in the group chat, telling them my situation, hitting send regardless of the lack of signal. I knew from experience that it would go through eventually. I just hoped it would be sooner rather than later. Gibson let out a loud, high-pitched whine, her tone rising in volume as she began to bark. High, persistent yips that were totally unlike her. She backed away, then let out a stream of urine, her hind legs trembling as she did. I looked up from my phone and saw what she had spotted. Across the lake, something was moving in the trees. I saw fingers wrapping around a tree trunk, too high up, the nails too long and too sharp to be a person. Whatever this giant was, it looked similar to a man, but it was massive. It peered out at me from beneath the boughs of the trees, its head probably 15 feet off the ground. Its skeletal limbs matched the monochromatic tone of the birches on either side of it, a gray, pale white shade. I couldn't distinguish the entire form of it in the shadows, but I could make out its eyes. They reflected back at me, catching the gray light coming through the clouds. And then I saw its mouth spread wider in a grin, teeth dripping blood, and it disappeared back into the darkness. The temperature felt like it had dropped to 30 below again, and I began to shiver involuntarily as I looked down to see Gibson doing the same. There was only one choice, only one place we could go. Back to the cabin. It was either that or risk plunging the truck into the frozen lake, attempting to drive across. We were on a small peninsula surrounded by water on all sides. Only one way in and one way out, and that way was blocked by the body of a giant brown bear. I took the dog back inside the cottage and locked the doors, taking uneasy glances outside through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. What the hell was that thing in the forest, I asked myself over and over again, but no answers came to mind. There were no creatures I could think of that were 15 feet tall, with reflective eyes that stood on two legs like a man, capable of disemboweling a full-grown brown bear, capable of causing the temperature to plunge all around me. There was only one creature capable of that, and it wasn't supposed to exist. It was something from myth, from folklore, from legends that weren't supposed to be real. "It's a Wendigo," I said out loud, immediately regretting the words as if saying them made them true, as if saying them would summon it. Wendigos are supernatural creatures born of Canadian First Nation folklore. They live in cold, remote places and make people go mad merely through their presence. They thrive on hunger, despair, and loneliness of their victims, who usually live in remote communities. They drive families apart, instilling urges of cannibalism in people and making them want to consume their loved ones. During the lean, hard months of the winter, this usually happens. They turn people into raving cannibals, driving away all their loved ones, and then once they're alone, the Wendigo strikes. It either consumes you while you're still alive, tearing flesh from your bones while you beg and scream, or it turns you into one of its own kind. But the Wendigo's greatest curse is that no matter how much flesh it consumes, it only grows hungrier. With every ounce of meat it takes in, it grows taller and more emaciated. Its hunger grows more insatiable with its height, until it's a towering beast with its head amongst the treetops as it roams the forest, constantly searching for its next meal. Gibson whimpered and burrowed her face into my armpit as if hearing my inner thoughts. Trying to reassure her, I stroked her fur and told her it'd be okay, although I had a feeling it wouldn't. I tried to get the fire going again, but it was a fruitless effort. Everything inside the stove was damp and wet, and scolded myself for dousing the fire with so much water. Still, I kept at it, knowing we might be stuck here for a while. Pretty soon the wind was howling and blowing outside, and the snow was piling up in front of the door. I made a point of opening it every so often to clear the snow from the steps, knowing that I would need firewood, taking weary glances off into the forest across the lake as I did so. Finally, I got the fire started, a low guttering flame in the stove, which wanted to go out all the time. Everything was damp, but I kept feeding it fresh kindling, nursing it, until it was able to keep going by itself. Hours passed as we waited to either run out of firewood or be attacked by the creature. We were running low on kindling and the sun was beginning to set. My stomach rumbled with hunger when I felt something strange. The ground suddenly shook beneath my feet, and I heard Gibson whining from beside me. "What is it, girl?" I asked, my voice catching in my throat as I realized the answer. It was the creature. It was back. The dining room table began to rattle and bounce up and down as whatever was outside got closer, and I imagined the creature lifting the roof off a cabin like a top on a dish in a fancy restaurant, picking me up and eating me whole like a wriggling shrimp. A second later, there was a sound at the front door, metal being ripped and sheared as I realized the creature was making its way in. The screen door landed on the ground with a crash, and then the wooden door was being torn from its hinges an instant later. Cold air rushed inside as Gibson began to let out shrill, panicked barks of terror. I heard the thing tearing apart the front entrance, easily ripping apart the wood and making the doorway larger so that it could come inside. I tipped over the dining room table to use as a barricade. I picked up a chair, the only weapon I could find nearby, thinking I could throw it at the thing's face to defend us, when I heard a strange noise from the front. It was a car horn honking. Someone had come to save me. I heard a loud ding and pulled out my phone and saw the green check mark beside my group chat, indicating that at some point it had gone through, at some brief moment when there'd been a gap in the clouds. Reading the new messages brought a hopeful smile across my face. "Matt, you just had to skip town a day early and go ice fishing, didn't you?" "What the hell is that thing?" Ted was yelling from outside. "I don't know, but it's trying to get inside. Jay, are you there?" I shouted back that I was. There was a loud screech from outside, which I realized had come from the monster. They'd actually wounded it somehow. I ran to the front door with Gibson and looked out, seeing the creature for the first time. It stood with its back to us, its head among the treetops, even taller than it appeared at first. My friends had caught it off guard, but now it was fully aware of them, and it was going after them. The Wendigo was distracted by something in front of the cottage, and I realized that one of my friends had gotten out of the car and they were using themselves as bait so that I could flee the cottage safely. They had driven across the ice with their lighter vehicle, just as I had hoped to do. I guessed that they'd run into trouble moving the body of the giant bear which blocked the road. "Jay!" Ted screamed out the window, driving the car in a circle on the ice, as if too terrified to stay still. I raced over to the car, slipping and sliding on the ice. It was Matt who was distracting the Wendigo, I realized, and I called for him to get away from the thing. It was too large, too fast. He didn't know what he was dealing with, but that was Matt. He was always act first and think later kind of guy. Not only that, but he often put himself in harm's way for his friends. He turned to look at me and gave a thumbs up, his attention diverted from the creature for a split second. As Gibson and I got into the car, we heard his scream. I looked up to see the Wendigo, close the distance in an instant, and was picking him up like an insect, turning him over and beginning to bite him. As Matt screamed for help, the creature peeled off his skin, exposed his skull as it ate his face. The calls for help turned to bubbling gurgles and wet, choking sounds, and I nearly got out of the car to run after him, but Ted grabbed my wrist and pulled me back inside. "You can't save him," he said with wet-rimmed eyes, and eventually I relented. We raced our way across the icy lake, making a path through the blizzard, cutting a swath off the fresh-fallen snow on our way back to mainland. For a while, we debated what to do. Should we call the police? Our friend had just died, after all, but we knew that if we did, we'd be considered suspects. And with no other reasonable explanation, they'd pin his death on us. They'd say we'd killed him. There were no boxes they could check on an official police report citing a Wendigo attack. So, since such things didn't exist, being myths and legends, we'd be their only suspect. As it turned out, we didn't have to worry about it, though. A message popped up from Matt on the group chat just a few minutes after we got home, and I had to tell myself that it wasn't all just a nightmare, a hallucination from the cold and lack of sleep and food. But Ted and Greg both told me I hadn't imagined it. What we saw was real, as much as I wish it wasn't. The three of us read the message on the group chat again and again. My heart was beating fast, and a sick knot was growing in my stomach, bile rising in my throat that I could taste inside my mouth. Hey guys, you really missed out on a feast. Ice fishing is just as much fun in a blizzard, if not more so. Let's reschedule the trip for next week, okay? I'll be waiting for you here. As much as we didn't want to go, we've resolved that we have to. We can't leave Matt like that. We have to help him. Next week, we're making the trip back up there, even if it kills us.